Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Live Academy, the virtual design learning platform by Meal Middle East Architecture Lab. My name is Riyad Joucka. I'll be the moderator for these sessions, and I'm logging in from Dubai. And today we have hundreds of people joining us from tens of countries. So if you are new to the program, please visit our website for upcoming sessions. Our aim is to basically spread these ideas in these uncertain times. So we've been appreciating this international presence that our platform is experiencing so far. As for today's lecture, our guest is Gilles Retsin. And I've known Gilles for years now, having graduated with him from the Architectural Association School of Architecture, where we've had many opportunities to meet up in London, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, where we both got to teach under the
Yes.
directorship of Tom Verbes. A very cool program with a lot of people that joined up. So I got to know him a lot better and closer. And over the years, I've admired his tenacity and grit and constant dissatisfaction with the status quo, which has led him to carve his own path in architectural discourse. It's been very interesting to see how his work has evolved over these years and sort of evolved into this more informed and unique aesthetic, which is constantly, instantly recognizable. Sorry. It belongs to a school of thought that is called discrete architecture, and I believe Gilles will discuss that with us today. So I'll leave it to Gilles to expand on this subject. And I think also that Gilles prepared a lecture that is kind of more informal and a more personal one rather than an academic lecture, which is also always very interesting. And that's the nature of our platform. So please, if you haven't already, please sign up to as many lectures and classes as you can. Our aim is to use this time of uncertainty and isolation to connect people and spread knowledge. And I'd remind you that Q&A will be taking 1 hour into the lecture, so you can either use the raise hand tool to ask the question live to Gilles on video, or you can use the Q&A button where I would read your question and you'd get an answer from Gilles. So please be mindful if you've asked a question already, please give space to other people because our time is limited. And but we also really like this sort of informal and friendly place of idea exchange that we created in this virtual space. Originally from Belgium, Gilles Retsin is an architect and designer living in London. He studied architecture in Belgium, Chile, and the UK, where he graduated from the Architectural Association. His design work and critical discourse has been internationally recognized through awards, lectures, and exhibitions at major cultural institutions such as the Museum of Art and Design in New York and the Royal Academy in London, the Centre Pompidou in Paris as well. Gilles Retsin won first place in the competition for the main installation at the Tallinn Architecture Biennale, where he also qualified with his proposal for the Budapest New National Gallery and Concert Hall in Nuremberg. Gilles Retsin is the program director of the MArch Architectural Design at UCL, the Bartlett School of Architecture. He's also the co-founder of the UCL Design Computation Lab, which does high-profile research on new design and fabrication technologies. Gilles is also the co-founder of AUAR, a startup in automated architecture and a design-led consultancy based in London. Before founding Gilles Retsin Architecture, Gilles worked as a project architect with Christian Perez. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Gilles Retsin.
Thank you so much, Riyad, for the kind introduction. So I'll just get started, I guess. There we go. So yeah, thank you so much to Live Academy, to Riyad for putting this event together. I think it's absolutely fantastic to see how insanely international the audience is, with people from Australia, from up to Argentina, like an incredible difference in time zones there. I also think that it's interesting that we've kind of all begin to come together during this pandemic on platforms such as this one. I think it's great that somehow, although we can't travel anymore and we can't meet in person, that in one way or another we have kind of started to communicate more and to come together online. So my lecture today is called Building, with different meanings, like building as in the verb to construct, but also building as in the object, and building not only as building buildings, but also building positions, building ideologies, building arguments. And as Riyad mentioned, I've tried to kind of make this lecture a bit less academic, so we won't kind of start with half an hour of kind of hardcore theory and positioning, but it will be kind of my attempt in a way to explain a little bit more how I ended up doing the work that I'm doing today and what my journey has been through that work. But as you know, theory is very important for my work. We will also talk about theory. So like this will come in my kind of arguments and thinking behind the work are inseparable from the work. So I'll present that as well, but I think we can do it in a way a bit lighter touch. And there's a few entities in the lecture that are interacting with each other. It's really kind of, as we've also seen in the previous talk by Arthur Mamumani, like I think architects today operate in a kind of ecological way, like everyone has a number of things that they're running and that are kind of feeding into each other. So this talk will show tangentially a little bit of the work from my teaching at the Bartlett. It will show also work of AUAR, which is my design tech consultancy that I co-founded together with Molly Claypool and Manuel Jimenez Garcia. We all three of us also teach together in the Bartlett, so that's kind of like one big kind of chunk of things that we're doing. But the primary focus though of the talk will be my own practice. Like it will really kind of run through kind of my personal journey, and then we'll make little kind of escapes in a way to the other activities in my ecology of work. And what I want to do is kind of tell you in a way a bit the history of how my practice started, where it came from, and take a bit on the journey of going from what really was a kind of an avant-garde practice that was trying to build a portfolio, a body of thinking, an aesthetic, a kind of style almost you could say, to then kind of slowly bringing that work to build scenarios, to thinking through construction and tectonics of these things, to begin to work with clients, to now kind of you know competing on for bigger projects and public commissions. I will also talk about how, as an architect, I strongly believe that our output is not primarily buildings. Our output is architecture, and architecture is primarily about ideas. So we'll also talk a bit about these two books that I've edited, one on the discrete and one on robotic building, together with Molly and Manu. You're also encouraged to purchase those books after this lecture, etc. And then a kind of collective teaching at the Bartlett, playing around with robots, etc. So I titled kind of the first use of building will be building practice, right? It will be about like how do you start out kind of creating in a way a practice, and what is the specific mode of practice that I'm running. And I would say there is this kind of key date for me when everything kind of started, and that's 2008. And 2008, I always joke about that. That's the year that I graduated, and I think that was officially, until recently, the worst possible year that you could ever graduate as an architecture student, because that was the year that the global economy collapsed, that the all kind of architecture practices started shutting down, the kind of crazy economic times that we had seen before came to a halt, and it was really kind of a very difficult moment. So now, of course, you know, for people that are graduating this year in 2020, I cannot say that 2008 was the worst year anymore. It's definitely kind of surpassed now in 2020. But so when I graduated in 2008, I graduated from architecture school in Belgium. I had also studied in Chile and in South America for a kind of exchange year. And I, as a student, I was extremely interested in the digital, as we called it. I looked up to the work that was being done in London and at Columbia. We didn't have access to that work. We were kind of really just trying to understand what was happening in these crazy schools. And I was also always kind of very interested in theory. I was an extremely nerdy teenager, always reading philosophy books and kind of hesitating between politics, philosophy, or architecture. So I kind of like just read all of these, you know, manifestos and books that were on the shelves in the library back then, and tried to then use that also to inform kind of what we were doing. And of course, you know, I was kind of lucky just when I graduated that crisis had almost hit, but it hadn't it had not entirely sunk through. So I did manage to find a job that was at Lava. That was my first kind of real architecture job. And that was also the same time that Grasshopper came out. So I became the kind of Grasshopper nerd in the office, building some of the very first parametric models with a kind of very, very primitive version of Grasshopper. That was like the very first kind of beta trial of Grasshopper. So I was building this kind of like BIM models, etc. And then at some point when the crisis hit, I was actually in a way forced to move to Switzerland, which was to a certain extent immune to financial crises. There's like they're just sitting it out there. So I got a job at Christian Carrots. And that was, I would say, like for me, was kind of an incredibly important moment, because I came from quite a different direction. I mean, I came from kind of in architecture school, you know, playing around with lots of computational work. I was really indebted to a kind of a certain theoretical position that was affiliated with, you know, the work of Greg Lynn and Patrick Schumacher and all of these people. And I landed myself in a typical Swiss architecture office. I mean, an extremely good Swiss architecture office, but with a very different way of working, a very different ideology. And that kind of, for me, was, I think, consciously looking for another world, because I like to kind of, you know, put things into question. So I thought like, well, this is going to be highly interesting to be there, right? And what I really kind of learned there, I didn't work on these two projects here, but they were, I mean, the kind of ideology behind those projects was lingering around in the office. I was mainly working on this project, which was the Museum of Modern Art in Zurich. And I think what I kind of learned there all of a sudden was a position of architecture that, you know, had nothing to do with what I was reading of all these like American theorists or this kind of London-based theorists. Like, this was about architecture as a kind of a disciplinary discourse. And very importantly, it was also about assembly. Like, I finally kind of understood that whatever we are drawing and whatever we are in a way composing buildings with, that this was done somehow with parts, and that these parts had a certain behavior or a certain meaning or a certain history, and that you could set up an architectural practice that investigates these parts. And that would not kind of, you know, that would kind of try to understand like what they mean, how they work, how you could twist them, how we could change them. And that for me was really kind of an eye-opener, because before, in the work that I had done in architecture school, I was kind of operating with this world on the left, right? I was pulling meshes. There were no parts. It was just kind of a continuous kind of like modeling process. And we were not kind of engaged with ideas of, you know, of fabrication, of materiality, of parts at all. It was just basically computer meshes, right? And then you would kind of try to fabricate those meshes almost as an afterthought. And so in this world, it's very different, right? Like what you see in this model is basically, that's kind of an investigation on architecture, right? It's a research on architecture where you see that this is a building without columns. It's a building without a core as such. It's a building where the core and the column become one. And there's a whole kind of, I think, super intelligent game going on with a kind of, you know, a true architectural experiment, right? But anyway, I still wanted after Carrots to, you know, continue kind of my dream of going to London to study at the DRL. I had managed to save a bit of money working in Switzerland, and with that kind of, you know, with the savings, I kind of managed to get myself into the AA and yeah, confront myself with that community. So we developed with Robert Stewart Smith, this kind of crazy high resolution 3D printed house project. So this is like a completely fibrous mess, entirely continuous, but also in a strange way, it does actually have parts and parthood relationships, because this is a volumetric thing. It's not a kind of a mesh that we were pulling, but this is a kind of an entirely scripted process where little bits and pieces connect to each other to form this kind of you know, continuous fibrous, insane mass. We 3D printed this model. That model then ended up in the Centre Pompidou, which is, I think, one of the greatest things that can happen as a student, that your model gets kind of purchased for the Centre Pompidou and exhibited there. But so when I then graduated from the AA and got the opportunity to start teaching at the Bartlett and at University of East London in London, I really also kind of then had to ask the question, like, how do we now build the position, right? Like with this kind of experiences, reacting to this like world that we have landed in, this post-crisis world, how do you kind of define your position as an architect, as a young architect in that world? And that kind of, in a strange way, coincided with two books by Mario Karpel, an architectural historian who's also a professor at the Bartlett. And the first one is The Digital Turn in Architecture, 1992 to 2012. That book may be, 1992, maybe like even from before when a lot of you were born. But I mean, it's interesting that when you write a book that you also close a chapter. So this book in a way closed a chapter, right? It was like I think there was a moment that there was a feeling that something has had its time maybe in one way, and it kind of we are kind of drawing a line, right? So that book is kind of doing that. And then the second book, I mean, not a book, but a second article was extremely important, which is Breaking the Curve, which was written for Art Forum in 2014. And that article really presents a kind of, it breaks in a way Greg Lynn's curve, which was, the kind of ideology of continuity, an idea that we could think about architecture without any kind of notion of discreteness of parts, of individual parts, but that architecture would be just one whole that morphs and reacts to kind of outside criteria, that kind of organic almost model of architecture that was radically opposed to, modernism, where modernism was composed of like universal parts, circles, squares, beams, columns, etc. So Mario Karpo's book, in a way, critiqued that model. It broke this curve by Greg Lynn, and it argued for a kind of architecture that would be actually digital. So meaning an architecture that would actually consist of discrete units, building on the argument that actually the way that computers work, that it has very little to do with this kind of mathematical curves and with the idea of continuity, but that actually computers are all about discreteness. So they're all about basically on a massive scale correlating little bits and pieces. So it's a model that kind of, that invited to kind of question in a way how we had been thinking about the digital until that moment, right? And I mean, in a kind of blunt statement, you could say that the digital was kind of all about creating a kind of an overall super form, which is this form that has no parts. It would be evolved. It would be this smooth kind of, this fish as here by Frank Gehry. And then afterwards, you would have to kind of use digital tools to cut and slice these forms in order to be able to fabricate them. So that was kind of also what I was doing in Germany, right? So I was kind of like basically scripting models to take an overall form and to produce then a series of, of differentiated components to then be able to recreate that form. And we were kind of then thinking as a generation that we were very influenced by that article by Mario, and we were also very intrigued by kind of looking at what digital production in reality, that post-crisis reality looked like, right? Because then it had taken off with Amazon, with Uber, with Airbnb. And then we realized that actually, like this is digital production, right? This image of the Amazon warehouse, that is a digital platform. That has nothing to do in a way with, with kind of mass customizing kind of crazy super forms, but it's much more kind of a cold and harsh logistical process, right? And we were also interested, influenced by the kind of the outfall of this crisis, to begin to think about the digital not only as a formal process or a stylistic process, but also really as a process that is engaged with, that has deep political and social consequences, right? And we know that today, now it seems such an obvious thing, right? That the digital is an incredibly, I mean, it's something that's really reconfiguring how we live together. I mean, look at us now, we're on Zoom kind of all talking to each other. But also look at the discussions around Twitter, putting a little note on Donald Trump's post, and then the question like, are tech companies responsible for that or not? We're, also talking about post-capitalism. The universal basic income has now been introduced in Spain as of today. We're talking about automation really as a process that is not just, that allows us as architects to engage again with society and not just kind of work on a stylistic level. So I think we could say that this combination of these two experiences in a way started to then define my position, right? And what I was really kind of interested in, and now it also seems pretty obvious if you look back at that, right, is this idea that, is just this idea of like, can we actually compute parts instead of computing overall, shapes, right? Can we actually work with parts? And it's such a deep disciplinary architectural question, right? To do something with parts. You can see that this is Froebel, he's the inventor of the kindergarten. This is a block model that he developed. And this is now assembled in the shape of actually the Robbie House by Frank Lloyd Wright. And there was also the precedent of the work by Philippe Morel, who was building, models with this kind of like pixel-like blocks, right? So kind of beginning of a digital understanding of a part. And that for me was pretty obvious, right? Because if you look at this model here, back in Switzerland, is kind of an investigation of a research on architectural parts and their assemblies and their compositions and their behavior. And this is also kind of doing that, but on a very, very different way. So the question was like, could we actually apply kind of digital thinking to architectural parts and to kind of go from that as a model that is very different from, Greg Lynn's model, right? And at the same time, also people like Jose Sanchez, who's a good friend of mine, and we were together in London at that time, working in offices, and he also started a research agenda looking at basically these parts, and with the idea, questioning if these parts could actually be used to kind of interact with people, for example, introducing a series of social questions. So I wanted to kind of, begin to use this for me as a real architectural disciplinary question. Like I wanted to understand what happens if we make architecture that only consists of a single repeating part. What are the consequences of this? And not only what are the stylistic consequences and the aesthetic ones, although they're extremely important for me, but also questions of like, could we actually produce architecture in a radically different way when we start to think about it through these parts? So for example, this is a simple workflow for the Tallinn Pavilion, where you can see the kind of the economic potential or the logistical potential of thinking in this way, right? So we would buy a single material, just a stack of timber, would CNC that material, one sheet would become one part, these parts would be assembled, and we would have a kind of a pile of these parts, and these parts could then be assembled into that specific pavilion, but they could also be assembled into multiple other pavilions, right? The parts would pre-exist that pavilion. That would allow us to kind of set up an extremely efficient workflow. And also, and I'll expand on that later, it has a lot of architectural consequences, right? So on the one hand, there is this like aesthetic and deep architectural desire, right? Where I want to kind of understand what it means to make a space with, limited sets of repeating parts. But on the other hand, there's also this kind of vast economic and, technological consequences of that statement, right? It's such a simple statement, but it has vast consequences. So if we are building today in like this way, we are building in an extremely complicated way with thousands and thousands of different parts and processes, which makes building extremely expensive, unaffordable, prone to accidents. And also, I think in many ways, the difficulty of combining all of these parts together is also one of the reasons why the world around us is increasingly ugly. Because if you need to be able to design thousands and thousands of little bits and pieces together, it is a lot of work and it is extremely difficult. So you need to be an office that has a lot of experience and a lot of dedication to extreme detailing and extreme kind of control over architectural details. You need a very forgiving client or a very interested client to enable this kind of processes. If these things are not there, you end up in a world that cannot deal with parts, right? A world that is assembled in a bad way, that has like ugly joints, that is, just not able to to generate a kind of a convincing architectural world. So this is both technical, but this is also like deeply architectural. And we saw this also as an opportunity to begin to kind of think about these economic consequences, think about technical and logistical consequences. We could fully automate this process. You could never fully automate 7,000 or 8,000 different parts. That's impossible. But if you're building with a limited set of parts, you could automate both the assembly of those parts, the construction of these parts themselves, the cutting and everything. We could build this like extremely short production chains to achieve architecture, right? So we started to, at the Bartlett, we started to experiment with these models, programming industrial robots to basically assemble this incredible Baroque chairs from just repeating Lego-like little building blocks. You could do multiple, like endless variations on these chairs. We are still actually mass customizing. We're not mass customizing in overall form, but with a cheaply produced set of parts, we could actually produce incredible variation. We started to scale up these processes, thinking how we could actually assemble then larger and larger building blocks. And that then really gives kind of rise to another model of an architect, right? Like the architect in this case is someone, first of all, who needs to have an idea before he begins to build. This is not an architect that is reactive, but he's proactive. It's an architect who designs in advance a set of parts. He may even manufacture that himself, like Miguel Fissac or Jean Prouvé or this Soviet architects here. And then they would basically, when they have developed this kind of sets of parts or these technologies, then they could basically begin to build multiple instances or variations with these parts, right? So this also means that the architect, in a way, is no longer a kind of a victim of a powerless kind of entity in a large process of construction, but the architect is controlling almost everything, right? He's prescribing almost everything, and it's very difficult then to mess this up or to value engineer these things. So I kind of like that kind of world, in a way, reintroducing that idea of like the master builder or the kind of architect who's in charge. And also let us say that automation is really a design project, because all of these attempts really start with design, right? They start with the design question. So we could use that kind of this investigation, this idea about parts, to really kind of engage as well with a kind of disciplinary history of architecture, right? So our kind of statement then was like building on Colin Rowe's essay, the mathematics of the ideal villa, that that we had actually never been digital, right? That actually, just as Colin Rowe was saying that basically classical architecture and modernism, that they were the same. A modernist villa was actually following the same kind of sets of proportions and the same elements as you would find in a classical villa. So therefore, we had never been modern. In a similar way, we could kind of look at the last decade of the digital and argue that we had never been digital, because we had always thought through continuity. So that kind of like question, I think, is super interesting for me, that we could actually go on this kind of journey to try to figure out what a digital building would look like, a building that understands its parts in a digital way, which means that they need to be thought of as kind of discrete, essentially meaningless units that can be assembled together. So and that's really that design project, right? And it's also, I mean, I always like to kind of bring up this model here, the Maison Domino by Le Corbusier, as a kind of like as a kind of a model to react to or to revolve around, because in a way, like that model is the one that has led globally to, it's globally kind of the most successful model. We're all confronted with this, wherever country you're listening from now, you're probably either inside one of these dominoes right now, or you will see them outside of your window, right? So I think it's really interesting to investigate kind of the persistence of this modernist model and to kind of act on that. Like, and I call this model really like the kind of the bones or the hardcore of architecture, like this kind of persistent, undeniable reality of that thing, right? The bones. And I want to kind of, change that model, right? Because like that's that model that is the kind of like there's a creative opportunity there. And I always produce this kind of like blunt diagrams that are showing basically like this is my blunt diagram showing architectural history of like the past few decades, right? We had the modernist model, the postmodernist model, trying to reconcile itself with the domino by adding like, you know, some colors and shapes to it, and trying to you know, change the kind of the rationality behind that model, messing it up. You had Decon, you know, with Peter Eisenman, which is basically also trying to, you know, change the kind of the modernist rationale behind that, break the form function logic almost by kind of intersecting two of these dominoes. And then you had the kind of, you know, the digital project, the parametric project, which never got around, I would argue, kind of the domino, right? It's kind of a fitting out of the domino to communicate a message of progress, a plasterboard cladding that tells us that this building, you know, is progressive, and that it's that we're now in a fluid space. But hiding behind that plasterboard, you have this kind of, you know, the reality of that persistent domino. Or then like the triple O scene, like I don't know if you're familiar with that kind of object-oriented ontology gang, where we've seen a lot of work in the US coming from that, where essentially we're trying to make buildings read somehow as you know, intriguing objects that are you know, that are kind of detached from their context, but also of their kind of tectonics, which is essentially then the kind of an object with a series of slices, which then reproduce again these domino, right? And then the model that you see on the on the right there is really then that kind of a discrete model, right? Where all of a sudden there are that thing is entirely rethought through parts. And there are no more columns, there are no more floor slabs. There's an entirely different question of superform. Like there is no kind of desire to establish that kind of superform. We're just left with a kind of an assembly of parts that could materialize themselves in many different kind of spatial entities, right? We could, in this case, for sake of the diagram, it's reconstructed a domino, but it could also be an entirely kind of different space, right? It could also be a kind of much more fluid organization of space. It could be, it could basically, it's kind of flexible to adopt and build on different ideas of space, right? And like this is another diagram that I do kind of like speculate about these radical shifts in architecture, which I'm interested in, this kind of fundamental changes in architecture. Like you could argue basically that, you know, everything before, like modernism was the moment that flipped architecture inside out, I like to say. So basically before modernism, architecture was almost always based basically on the wall, and then you had to span in a way between the walls. But modernism flipped that. It's like, you know, that kind of architecture legacy times -1, because the wall kind of radically disappears. So I like to kind of do those, right? And I think also for me as an architect, it was a kind of a creative question as well. Like this is kind of also a diagram that is showing basically what we were designing with and what is left for us. And so you could argue that, you know, modernism dissolved mass and was basically building architecture from a composition or a kind of tension between surfaces and planes and lines. Then the parametric was making a fluid version of this kind of surfaces. And then I think like what's left for us, right? If we, you know, mass has been kind of used, surfaces have been used, fluid surfaces have been done, but like making architecture purely out of like lines or points, like basically meaningless kind of super primitive entities, or data, like that has not been done, right? Like this is a kind of a moment for a kind of creative opportunity. This is like the kind of more tacky version of that diagram, right? Like we've done mass, we've done surfaces, we've done fluid surfaces, but now can we kind of think in a way about architecture that is built of you know, very, very primitive entities that are then the equivalent in a way of data. So in my practice, of course, I mean, this kind of process that I kind of presented to you now, this obviously didn't happen all at once. Like it started in a way by taking the model of the 3D printed house, the Softkill project, and introducing in that project a series of constraints. So it's basically just saying like, well, we have all these kind of like elements that are assembling, but rather than giving them ultimate freedom to assemble in any possible configuration, which would give rise to this kind of fibrous mass, we'll actually constrain the parts, and they always be straight lines, and they can always only connect under a limited set of angles, right? Which is literally the definition of kind of discretizing something. Like we're reducing the amount of possibilities, and in doing that, we're making in a way something more constructible or kind of more controllable, right? And that was kind of the early work that we were doing with that. So someone then at a later stage turned this into a Grasshopper plugin. So these days you can kind of do this with a button in Grasshopper, but back then for us it was primarily kind of an ideological position, right? We were very interested in basically thinking about what it would mean if you would kind of begin to work with this like discrete assemblies, right? Like the beginning of a discrete assembly. But of course, these discrete assemblies, like they would still have quite a bit of tolerance. Like in a way, the parts, they're kind of the moments where they join together, still had relatively a lot of freedom, right? Like you can see that there is a constraint, like the lengths are becoming more and more serialized, the joints are becoming more and more serialized. But I mean, it would of course still be kind of quite a hellish process to try to manufacture this building, right? And to a certain extent, the parts are also still indebted to the whole, like this kind of still exists to a certain extent as a kind of a super form. Like you can't really make the argument in this case that the parts are on the same level of importance as the building itself. It's still kind of a very, you know, the parts by themselves are not kind of necessarily able to construct to have as much autonomy as the overall form of the building. This was for the Guggenheim Helsinki competition. So that was a kind of stage in my practice where in order to develop an agenda and a position that we were doing an insane amount of competitions per year. Like I think we're doing almost, I think 10 in 1 year. Just as a way, I mean, not even necessarily trying to actually win those competitions, right? But just using them as a means to develop in a very accelerated way, like develop an agenda, right? And figure out like, okay, what is the direction here? Like, where are we going with this work? So in a way, like doing these competitions was an extremely important process, right? This is the submission of this Guggenheim Helsinki competition, the kind of the brown package, and then the insane warehouse where essentially there were thousands and thousands and thousands of submissions of other architects thinking that they were capable of building a Guggenheim Helsinki. Like, I mean, like in hindsight, this is probably like was probably quite meaningless to participate in this competition. But ultimately, I mean, like ultimately, it was more, I think, for me to kind of develop an agenda, right, and use these competitions as a challenge. And that model for Helsinki also then went kind of, it was extremely well published, so that kind of image got really popular and started to kind of flood the internet. Another competition was one that we did in just a week, like it was very, very quick. And this was the idea to kind of really reduce the overall form and take something extremely, extremely banal as a starting point. This was a competition in Budapest for the Liget Park international competition for a museum building. And the idea was really to just take a slab, like the museum kind of a slab, duplicate it, and that would be the museum, right? It would just be basically 2 slabs. We would articulate those slabs with series and series of kind of repeating fibrous lines. Then give rise to this kind of, you know, strange fibrous mass that has a familiar aspect. Like it has these floor slabs, but then they're not really maybe floor slabs anymore. So it's this kind of like strange mess. This was kind of like a tectonic chunk where you see like, you know, lots and lots of these lines kind of connecting to each other, very constrained, like to like a limited set of angles, and then this kind of almost textiles or tapestries of the ceilings with these kind of voids that were inside of the ceilings running up. And that kind of like, you know, it's in a way like, while it's very reduced and it's working with this kind of, you know, the slab almost as a kind of, you could say a canvas, right? It's almost like a kind of, you just take a canvas and like as a painter, you would not give any shape to your canvas, right? I mean, it would be strange. You would just kind of take the square sheet and you would start kind of distributing material on that, right? So in a way, we were doing kind of the same, like enjoying essentially architecture that is not composed of you know, it's not a composition of kind of, you know, columns and beams. It's not a kind of a shaping of a continuous mesh, but this is making architecture from, you know, kind of linear matter that is almost the same as this kind of matter when you're painting, right? It's a kind of an extremely different way, I think, to make architecture. Like, it's not, nothing in this building would be familiar, right? It would just be a mass of lines. And it connects also, like, I think on an aesthetic level with a kind of minimalist work, like the work by Agnes Martin, which is this kind of, you know, this kind of seriality, right? It's a serial operation. It's always the same thing, repeating and repeating, but then creating these kind of like subtle differences. And at that period, I mean, and I think that's somehow like nice to, you know, to mention that as well. Like, I mean, I really think as an architect, in a way, to start an architectural office, the only thing you need is a laptop and an idea. And it's very different from other businesses, right? For other businesses, you would need to get a huge investment, you would need to buy machines, etc. In this case, you know, these projects were done in processing, like an open source software. I was writing code, like sitting on my little laptop, traveling from, you know, place to place, finishing a project here in the airport or in the train, kind of building your own software, and really kind of the only thing you know, the kind of optimism was that you just need a laptop and an idea, and you can do something. You can submit a competition, right? You don't need a big office, like you don't need a huge infrastructure. You just need to know what you want to do and figure that out. So this was the package for Budapest. Just before I had to take the airplane because we were too late, so we flew into Budapest to deliver this thing. And then, funny enough, that package was a lucky package. So lucky and unlucky. So we actually were selected for the second round of that competition together with shop architects. So somehow we had like blasted our way with that 1 week effort and these kind of sessions on the train and in the airplane. We had kind of like blasted our way to the last round of that competition, right? Which would be, you know, I was 28 at the time. That was kind of an incredible moment where like, oh, like you can actually do this. Like you can actually seriously compete in this kind of world, right? With very little means. But then, I mean, then the jury decided actually that, you know, they took stock of who was in that last round, and they decided that, you know, this was not a selection of star architects, so they decided to launch a new competition where only Pritzker Prize winners and Reba Gold winners could participate. So Snøhetta and Sana then ultimately won that competition together, and then it never happened, right? But the nice thing is that we got paid, like the next round of the competition got paid out as a kind of like, you know, to make us, you know, to keep us silent as architects. So that was a very nice kind of welcome present, right? And then that project, I think for me is super important. Like it keeps kind of lingering on. Like this is kind of a later version of the same project that I just kind of wanted to investigate, which is much more reduced, is more based on of like, instead of built with sticks, it's built with little tiles almost, or like blocks. And then it's kind of, you know, we started fabricating chunks of this model, like casting these wires and pieces and trying to understand what these things mean. This was a kind of more exuberant variation in a way on the same system, which is bridging some of the moves between the Helsinki project and that Budapest project, etc. And then, you know, trying to figure out then like how we could get those projects more buildable, and a kind of a fascination that keeps lingering on, right? It's kind of that idea of the familiar slab that we then investigate with certain methods. Like in this case, there's still, you know, the elements are quite free to behave what they want to do. In this case, that's for the Bauhaus, and this, so it was much more reduced. It was just basically sheets that are assembled always under 90 degrees. And then this is the same kind of procedure, like investigating the roof, not the slab, but the roof in Helsinki, and then another version of that Helsinki project, which we used for a competition in Belgrade, where then, you know, this is kind of thought of in the timber sheets rather than wires, right? And then I think the project where that really launched the practice, or really kind of managed to crystallize the position of where things were going, was a project called Blokhut. And this started out with a friend of mine back in Belgium who had bought a piece of land, and he had invited me to design a villa for that piece of land. He's an architect himself, but he was working as an energy consultant, so he kind of didn't feel anymore like designing buildings, and he wanted to kind of like see what I would come up with. And as he's a very kind of rational person, I decided that we would come in proposing a completely discrete building where we would have a minimum amount of customization and a maximum amount of seriality. So like this is a kind of a small building block, and we kind of, the idea was that we would make thousands of these repeating building block, you know, saving on costs. It's all modular, it's scalable, you could kind of prefabricate all of those. And then we would have a minimum amount of customization. So the red zones were the zones that he would have to like, you know, pay a little bit more for, and we would have to kind of customize these zones. But in a way, they were also kind of repeating, and you know, they always use the same joint ultimately to connect to the serialized pieces. You see one of these intersections where this kind of serialized pieces plug into that central spine. Building models of this. Here with Nathan and Pablo, who were working with me during the summer, and they were kind of building this massive model to show that we could actually, you know, fabricate that thing, right? And I think as an architectural model, what it did, it's kind of like set out also the kind of aesthetic agenda for the practice. Like it was really showing that assembly and modularity and repetition could be exciting, and that it could result in a type of architecture that was really in between being kind of organic and assembled or natural and assembled. Like it's very confusing, like what actually happens here, right? If you look at that image, like I think it's really a kind of it's jagged, but it's not, you know, it's not discontinuous. It's made of parts, but it's not fragmented. So it's like I think that set out a kind of really a kind of idea what I wanted to build, right? And like it's also, I think as a building, it feels kind of warm and natural. It's kind of like rich timber textures, etc. That's then what was actually built by my friend. He obviously did not want to go on that adventure of building this thing, and he decided to build this building. And then that project, then, you know, you could recycle those parts. So we kind of recycled it into this building, also made a table with it. And then, I mean, in a way, like the attempt to then construct this building came with the Tallinn Pavilion. So the Tallinn Pavilion, it was a competition. I entered it by saying that it actually kind of asked for a parametric pavilion. That was the brief. But I was interested to really build a kind of a domino, right? Build a kind of abstract model that would talk about housing, that would talk about a larger scale, and kind of the pavilion would in a way not be a pavilion, but would be a fragment of that larger whole kind of domino-like model. So we designed these housing blocks first, then isolated a part of the housing block, and then set up this kind of workflow of, because the budget was extremely low, so we set up this super simple workflow. We just had to cut, you know, standard timber sheets, assemble them, and then we would be able to kind of really show that we could manufacture in a way multiple instances of the pavilion with different parts. And that was a really good decision also in terms of workflow, because we could keep designing until the very last moment. We could make design decisions on site. For budget management, this was fantastic. Like we could just use a bit more or a bit less parts, depending on like how the budget was evolving. And as a workflow, it was also like really simple, because we just had to basically manufacture, you know, 80 of these files of these building blocks. And then they would build this kind of, you could assemble one sheet of plywood into one modular building block that could perform in any condition. So these building blocks are stitched together to form continuous structures. They are stitched together under tension with steel rods. These are some of the kind of connections that we were making. And then the architectural decision was to show nothing of this kind of like technical engineering buildup, but to just show them as kind of, you know, objects in themselves, that you could still read them as like independent parts, right? So we went for this crazy adventure of just flying to Tallinn essentially with nothing, just knowing that there would be a CNC machine and a pile of sheets. I brought two friends, and I made a new friend there, and we started to kind of set up a workshop kind of factory. And then we also met these two guys. They were two German professional traveling timber tradesmen. So they call it Wandergesellen in German. So they have to work for 2 years, kind of traveling around Europe. So we made a deal with them. They were looking for jobs. So we made a deal with them that we would pay them beer and food, and they would be able to sleep in the workshop. They were very happy with that. And then they kind of like you see them, like they were sleeping here. And it's an old slaughterhouse in Tallinn. And then they were kind of building parts with us and contributing their knowledge of working with timber. We had this kind of this large pile. That's the kind of the assembly team after we managed to prefabricate everything. That was done in like 5 days, like super quick, just a 5-day effort. And then we came back 1 week later with a new team to do the actual build on site. So we're loading the truck here, shipping all of those parts to the site, placing the foundations there, and then beginning the kind of process of clicking together these parts. That was my site office back then, like just kind of, you know, the laptop and the ideas sheltering under a little tent. And then we were a small team as well. So this was Oscar, Kevin, and Ivo, who were just kind of, we were just 4 people building this thing again in like 5 days. We had assembled all of these blocks. It was kind of a very regular schedule. We would have to place like 10, 15 of these blocks per day. You would never have to look up which block to place where, because the blocks are repeating. So you could just kind of pick a block and then you install it. And you can see the screws here. Very, very kind of great process of building these things. Here you see like a crazy corner kind of hanging in the rain with these elements. That was the last piece being installed, and then the kind of opening event for that thing. And I think what is really interesting for me in this project is that ultimately, I mean, this is one of the first kind of large scale instances of like a discrete architecture being constructed. But it also then, like, you know, starts to build a position that, like, look, I mean, this is also about a larger scale. This is about housing. We could actually kind of, instead of building this kind of cookie cutter modularity that is fixed to architectural types, 1, 2, 3 bedrooms, we can actually begin to think about buildings purely on the level of these parts, right? And create kind of like different positions of how we like organize those parts. This is a 200-meter long housing block where, you know, it's all made of the same parts. These parts are positioned differently. And it's interesting that this difference is not, it doesn't cost anything. You don't need to customize that difference. It's always just an informational cost. It's just giving an instruction that this part needs to be in a different position. It doesn't cost any more money. It's just an informational task, right? Then what you then see, actually, you could actually make a kind of a comparison between that Blokhut and Tallinn. And I would actually say, like, they're obviously not exactly the same model, but I think they articulate the same agenda, right? And I think that was really great for me, that I could kind of realize that that kind of architectural vision could be built, and it could be built at a low budget, very efficiently, making use of this kind of, you know, modular workflow. And it was really kind of a dream, right? That, you know, we can build these things, like, this is not inaccessible. And you can see those kind of aesthetics and these moments, right? These kind of like things shooting out, these like parts repeating, you know, not being too orthodox at times as well about, like, you know, part count. Like, I mean, this thing just has this thing, like, this thing is like 90% repeating. This thing was like 80% repeating, but just kind of like enjoying those moments of like, oh, you know, we'll add something there just to, because it works for us, right? And now this project actually, in a beautiful story, also has an afterlife. Like, now we're actually got contacted by a kind of a festival slash minimal, like a minimal techno festival slash kind of organization of DJs, where Gabby is the guy in who's running this in Romania. And they've actually been working now for quite a while on setting up a kind of a process where we could collectively, with the people of that community, build a version of this project in a beautiful piece of forest, where it would become a kind of concert gathering ground for this like minimal techno community. And I think it's absolutely fantastic as a project. Also because I mean I am a fan of like minimal techno. It's it's all about seriality. It shares, I think, the same kind of aesthetics with my work, right? It's a kind of questioning hierarchy. It's questioning parthood relations. It's digital. It's serial and repetitive. So I mean, like for me, it's a kind of a fantastic brief. And a similar project, a similar story as this one for the Diamonds House. The Diamonds House was this kind of architectural vision for a project just outside Brussels, which would be 3 apartments, 3 loft-like apartments that would be stacked, and they're also all made of this kind of repeating parts on 3 different scales. And I think this for me is like the project that kind of emphasizes the image of what a discrete architecture could be, right? Like this is an architecture that, has only consists of parts. It's the parts that create what you see. They're independent of the whole. The building is kind of permanently unfinished. It's consistent. It's in one way organic because it's always the same operation of the same material. There is no, none of these parts have like, there's no columns or beams or slabs or surfaces. This is just a kind of a stacking of these parts, right? And then ultimately, there's of course like this kind of game with familiarity that you do see a kind of, you would say like, oh wait, but this is a floor slab, but actually it's not a floor slab. It's not as an architectural entity, it's not a floor slab, right? And I mean, I like this idea of like, it's almost a kind of cave-like experience that you have in this space, almost kind of very organic because it's the same material operation going through. And then we managed also to kind of build this project at the Royal Academy. We got a direct permission from the Royal Academy in London to build this thing. So again, we mobilized a workforce, in this case, students from the Bartlett. We took over the entire kind of ground floor in the Bartlett, building a series of this kind of lightweight, but really large building blocks, stacking them up, transporting them to the Royal Academy, a kind of impromptu exhibition there. This is Manya, my structural engineer, who has calculated kind of all of the crazy projects that we're doing. Like she's the one signing this off and kind of thinking with us through the process. And then kind of a process of building, lifting up those blocks and then building this installation. These are pictures by Studio Naro. Then where again, like you see that this project is actually, it's actually an investigation of the Diamonds House itself. Right? It's talking about, it's an attempt to kind of understand how these spaces would work, how they feel, that it's showing that they're feasible to build, that we can do this on very low budgets, and that we can kind of, like trying to understand the architectural experience of these things, right? And also like kind of, we arrange this kind of seating and working spaces in there, etc. Here you see it's kind of like pixelating in under the ceiling, and then some chunks that were distributed throughout the museum. Then we did an opening event there as well with a discussion with Mario Carpo, where the entire installation was covered with people. There's Peter Cook and Jan Reisner participating in the discussion there to kind of try to understand this further. And then that has then resulted, like we're still continuing this project. So we've made, we've done a number of other workshops like here in China, or this one here in Belgium, where we're scaling up those blocks and kind of making them better and better. And now we're actually at the instance that we are able to test this on a real scale. So this is a small house extension in Belgium, where we would actually build this house extension with these blocks that you see here. So that would be a kind of the first time that we leave kind of the exhibition setup and then try that out in a real scenario. And in one way or another, of course, that thing is actually also kind of an attempt for this, right? So that's the kind of the project that sets up the idea, and this is a kind of first instance of that. So we're working now again with Manya on kind of like engineering that whole thing. But then, of course, I mean, the larger vision of this is like what what we're doing in the Bartlett is then to also, the scenario where we would be assembling this with robots, right? We would be kind of like building those boxes with robots as we're doing here, with the students and kind of being able to fully automate that process, right? And kind of generate this kind of, just a set of parts and then a bunch of robots that in one way or another are assembling these blocks, right? And that's a bit like the mission in a way of AUAR, so the design tech consultancy that I run with Manu and Molly. So that's, whereas my practice is kind of very personal project. It's like it's kind of architectural, very deep architectural project, I think. And AUAR is in a way a kind of project that is, or a form of practice that is much newer as a model. Like it's not a traditional architectural practice. It's a kind of very different beast, right? And it's engaged with different questions. So AUAR is all about kind of, research, design tech consultancy, but also we're also kind of trying to, in a way, bring the advanced research that we're doing in the Bartlett's to bring that to a real world scenario, right? And we have kind of two, in a way, core technologies that we work with. So one is discrete assemblies of mainly timber blocks, and the other one is 3D printing. Some of you may know Manuel's company, Nagami. So there's this kind of idea that we could create an architectural platform to bring those technologies maybe in a much more, research or commercially driven way to the world, right? So we're interested, I think, very much in this kind of logistics as well. There's like some kind of like pitch decks about our robot-built housing projects that we're trying to do. We did a lot of things with AUAR. I mean, it just started kind of 1 year ago, but I mean, we have been writing a book, that's the robotic building book, which is talking about the future of automation and about how we can think about architecture. In automation, we've been working with Epic Games and Unreal on developing an AR interface to control industrial robots to build projects. We did a proposal for the British Pavilion in Venice. We got selected with that. Unfortunately, didn't win it ultimately, but it was a really exciting project about a fully automated pavilion that was curated by an AI. There's, of course, a voxel chair, which some of you guys may know. We did also an app for reacting to the COVID crisis, where we'd be able to quickly source makers and distributors of PPE. And then we're kind of continuing, one of the main projects we're doing is kind of the development of our own kind of building system, which we call Alice. And it started also as a student project. And so like Alice is kind of a long-term project where we're trying to develop that is actually kind of a modular housing system and going through all the stages to ultimately get this licensed and be able to present this to the world in a fully automated way. So including the kind of robotics, including the kind of like BIM-like softwares to run this, etc. But then also like, for example, the project that I just showed you, like the ambition, of course, with that project is also that we would be able to kind of, with our offer that then as a kind of fully automated version. Like we're doing this kind of like investigation to build one of them, but once it's engineered once, we could actually build it in multiple instances, right? We could actually build it hopefully 100 times. So we can actually offer that kind of investigation as a product, right? Which is a very different model of the architect. Like this kind of discrete way of working allows you to be proactive. Like we don't need to wait for a client, but we can kind of develop a system and then use it in multiple different instances because the parts are independent of the whole. So the ambition is to bring that as a kind of an automated system for house extensions, right? The same also, I mean, the development of this, the Alice building system. And we're also developing a kind of 3D printed building system as well. Anyway, back to buildings. I mean, I think I'm gonna run like a bit over time. I hope that's fine for you guys. I apologize. We'll try to skip a bit quicker through things, and I'll see where I stop. But I mean, I want to kind of talk a bit about these like consequences, right, of the system that I'm setting out, because I believe that they're not just stylistic, but that they're also in a way have deep architectural consequences. So this was Rem Koolhaas's provocation on his Venice Biennale, where essentially he's making the argument that that kind of world of the kind of ultra-modernist world that we live in, that has reduced architecture to just the ceiling, right? Like, whereas we used to be a volumetric profession, now we only have access to that kind of 1 millimeter, 1 centimeter plasterboard, right? Like that's what we do as an architect. Everything that is above and below the ceiling has been kind of expedited to other professions, right? Interior decorators, product designers, structural engineers, HVAC engineers. So our kind of world of architecture has become extremely superficial in many ways, right? We operate on surfaces. And therefore we kind of lost, I think, where we used to be a kind of a monolithic profession, as you can see here, that's the result of a monolithic profession. We've kind of lost that, right? And we, I think, extremely precarious moments to do that. And I think that has some like funny consequences that, and I mentioned that before, that if we operate in a world of this like 7,000 or 8,000 different parts and bits and pieces that need to come together on a building site, that inevitably results in ugliness, right? And I think it has put our position or the profession in an almost bizarre moment, right? Where actually, like, if you look at this building, this is around UCL, it's like a UCL hospital in London. And it actually turns out that the part, that is very beautiful here on the top. That's actually like aesthetically pleasing and beautiful and interesting, but that's actually not designed, right? Like this is done by the engineer. So it's not designed and it's not finished. That's beautiful. And that what is then designed, where an architect has been involved, is like, is meaningless and ugly and like, is that problem that we cannot just not design with these parts. It's impossible. You will always kind of inevitably end up in this kind of like terrible mess that you see here at the bottom, right? So it's this extremely strange thing that things that are not designed, that are not done by architects, are more beautiful than what we are doing as architects, right? So most buildings are better when they're unfinished, which is, a funny thing. And it actually, I would kind of like also go further with that and say that most buildings are also better when they don't try to be good. So, for example, Andy Warhol, his loft, is better than an apartment in many cases. I think the loft is kind of universally the most beloved kind of living environment. It was never designed, by definition, it's never designed for human inhabitation. They're old factory spaces or old storage spaces, but they're often much better than spaces that were particularly designed for their function to be living in. The best museums are abandoned, parking garages and industrial factories. Like they're often much better than a designed museum. So it's funny that actually, as architects, when we kind of are too much concerned, with kind of function and thinking that we're doing something good, we're often doing something really bad, right? And I think that's also like interesting to bring in this kind of idea that as an architect, I think it's sometimes really good to do something that precedes function, that is essentially meaningless. Like I think, the discrete blocks that I work with, they have no meaning. They're like blocks that are, in a way, they have a certain behavior, but they're not a column, they're not a slab, they're not referential. And somehow that kind of meaninglessness, that kind of lack of function actually makes architecture often very interesting, right? And you can actually like extrapolate it, I think, to lots of the best architectures are actually not trying to be good in the sense of having a good function, right? They're actually essentially kind of meaningless. Like, for example, Frank Gehry's famous design process for Bilbao, where he just takes a paper bag and then makes it a building. It's a super meaningless process, but it's so good, right? It's often much better than architects trying to give meaning to something. And I think this kind of what I'm showing here, I think there is a kind of this way of working, this discrete way of working, has deep implications on our profession. I think they have a kind of the agency or the possibility to turn around that like terrible kind of hyper ultra modernist world that Rem Koolhaas was talking about, right? Kind of superficiality of the architectural profession. And the way that like this can be done, I mean, I just showed this as kind of a small example. This is a building in Melbourne, one of my favorite buildings in Australia. And like that building is a typical modernist building, right? It's kind of, it's kind of consists of beams and a hierarchy of parts, slabs, everything kind of optimized for its specific use. And it's a beautiful building, right? It's beautiful because it's very well, it's very well designed, it's very well controlled, it's done really well. But like this would be a kind of you know, kind of parametric version of that model, right? You would hang like kind of, you know, curved surface under hiding those kind of elements. This would be like a kind of you know, another architect would do this, right? Hanging maybe like a metal kind of screen. The fire alarm you can never kind of hide. This would be like a Swiss kind of version, maybe, or La Capon Vasal kind of version, where you can just, you know, like everything bare bones shown as it is. But then the kind of like what this kind of discrete method in a way does is proposing to kind of like slice these timber beams, unroll them, pack all of this kind of functionality inside, and then make one more move, cut the ceiling, and result in something that has no more familiarity with any of these elements, right? It's just kind of architecture becomes a complete monolithic construction of just repeating parts that then you can kind of, in a way, expand that, you know, the plasterboard surface that we are constrained to. We can get rid of that, right? We can expand our space to that. And then architecture then, as a result, it's not anymore a kind of a composition of this like you know, this we have never been modern scenario. It's no more this kind of domino with ruled by a grid and by architectural types, but it becomes this kind of soup or mess of parts that are interacting with each other, right? And that kind of runs through all my projects, right? That there is none of this kind of architectural elements that we're familiar with is visible. And then that's architecture, right? We expand our space. We get rid of that kind of that thin surface, and all of a sudden we're in control of everything, right? Everything above and below you, right? And you cannot, like, it's very difficult to value engineer these things because they're kind of designed as this blocks or as these products. So I would say that like this discrete working method gives a lot of agency, I think, to us as architects, and it's a kind of a positive story that we could actually kind of you know, be maybe less vulnerable, right, in the process of building. I'll skip this a bit. We won't talk about that. I mean, another aspect that I think is important of working in this discrete way is like that you become a serial architect, like variation on the serial killer. So, and I would like to kind of show these images by Donald Judd, the artist, to show that kind of potential of seriality, right? Like the operation of a kind of a system or a palette that you set up for yourself that then can result into a whole body of work and a whole discourse without you having to react, you know, to a specific brief, right? Like you can kind of, you're faster. Like if you have set up a kind of one of those discrete systems, you can kind of, you don't need to start again for every single project, right? You can kind of, it's in a way a serial operation where you can use one part for multiple buildings, and you can kind of develop that body of work from that. And I think on the one hand, that's an artistic process, like kind of a deep interest in kind of what is like serial operations would mean, but it's also an economic process. Like it's also a process where, like, I just screen grabbed what I was doing when preparing this lecture, where we're actually kind of controlling, you know, an entire building, like just kind of calculating, you know, the cost of an entire building, that it becomes really feasible by doing that through these discrete systems, right? It's just a bit of like counting. It's almost like kind of perfect kind of BIMable world, right? Where you can work with and kind of be in charge of like producing all of the data for fabrication, right? Like we can do that. To wrap up, I mean, I think it's also interesting to say that with this serial architecture, that it could operate on different scales. There's no difference between, you know, what I'm flipping through here, right? Between all of these curves. Like one is more high res, it operates maybe for a client that is a bit more adventurous and has a bit more budget and a bit more time. But you could also operate more low res, on a lower resolution with less parts if the circumstances require it, right? So this is like, for example, the museum we did in Korea, which makes use of these massive parts, like ultra large, 15-meter long LVL beams. That again, I mean, the project did not change, right? This is this kind of serial operation. Like it's the same process, but it has a kind of slightly different setup. Then you could ask this question like, how low can you go with this, right? Like, what happens if we keep reducing the resolution with the argument, right? I mean, what is the kind of the end point, how low you can go, right? With this thing, like, could we say that this is a digital box or not, right? And like, I mean, like, I think these things are kind of like something that I'm currently like tinkering with and I'm working on, which is this like extremely low res um, discrete assemblies, which I still I think deeply digital and extremely radical. Like, although they are very reduced, I think they are still a kind of a type of space that we have never seen before and that has not kind of existed before, right? Which has this thin line between familiarity and then being something that is extremely unfamiliar and that we don't know, right? So I'm interested in these kind of modes, like even this one, which is like extremely boring. And I mean, I kind of, it's kind of weird that, I mean, I like to kind of explore the fringes, right, of these things and be kind of questioning if this kind of extremely reduced models, like how low can we push them before the project kind of collapses on itself. And I really think that this thing is still pretty amazing. Like I think if you would be walking around it, I think it would still be kind of deeply intriguing. I'm gonna just quickly flip through these because I want to keep time for questions. But like this is kind of the stage that we're in with the practice now. Like we're developing now kind of more and more kind of, in a way, I would say, projects that want to be built. Like that's really the effort now. Like the avant-garde kind of phase of experimentation and building up positions is I think a bit behind us now. And now the idea is to kind of really aggressively compete to get these things materialized. So that's this is a concert hall in Germany that is made entirely out of repeating CLT sheets. That's the computational model. So it's just a voxel with a simple kind of V-shaped element. And then like it's translated to always the same kind of repetitions of CLT panels that can be assembled. So that's the entire concert hall laid out flat on the ground, how to build a concert hall. Like that's the material you need to build a concert hall. And the kind of production line we're imagining is to be done like locally, just with a few industrial robots on a track, kind of milling away with also very minimal tool pads, milling away the CLT sheets, pre-assembling them, and then assembling them on the site. So this was also a competition where we were like very close. That's together with Stefan Markus Albrecht, a German friend of mine. We were very close to, we got selected in the last round for this one, competing with a number of international offices to try to do what is really the first timber concert hall, a fully timber concert hall in the world. We had an amazing team of engineers, Bollinger Grohmann and theater projects, thinking and working with us to develop this system. And again, I mean, to offer kind of a quick architectural critique of this, like this is not a glass box. You will think it's a glass box. It's not a glass box. This is not a building that has floor slabs and columns and beams. There are no columns or beams. There's nothing in this building that is familiar with anything that you know from a building. I would really dare to kind of argue that this building is more radical in how it's built and how it's conceived than like a very formally exuberant, flashy museum with like a lot of fluid surfaces. Like that, this building only consists of parts, right? It only consists of repeating elements. Like that is the same element as this one, same element as this one. What acts as a column here is the same element that is in the ceiling there. You walk from part to part. There is no floor. You literally step from part to part. And so this is a building that is truly kind of a timber monolith that is, although it's all 90 degrees, that is deeply organic. It's an organic timber monolith that still remains assembled, right? So it has all this kind of like strange contradictions there. And yeah, I mean, we can go into questions probably more on this project later. That's kind of the working process, flying in between Berlin and London, back and forth, working with our the very cuddly employee here who's criticizing the plans, and kind of like building a small team. And I think also that's kind of interesting, right? Again, that you can, you know, we were just two people developing, me and Stefan working on this project and doing a concert hall, right, in a kind of very short period of time. Again, a laptop and an idea. And I think to wrap this up, I think what is interesting is that architecture, like this discrete move, this move into automation, I think what it also does is that it brings back architecture to its kind of core, this kind of primitive world that we all share. I think it's not, the vision of this project is not that of a kind of a hyperbolic future with a kind of, 1960s retro futuristic aesthetic of like glossy surfaces and like immaterial kind of world. This is a world that has like real materials. It's kind of a primitive core, I think, that is universal. The aesthetics come from assembly. It shares something that it's difficult to pinpoint down whether this is like a kind of a project that belongs to Japan or to Europe or to to any other place. It's based on I'll talk a bit about that more, but it's this kind of primitive nature, I think, that is interesting, right? Like ultimately this is the same, right? These two things. So that whole process of like computation, robotics, automation brings us back to this kind of primitive future, which is also what we are seeing today with like the whole Corona crisis, and we're all again kind of taking the bicycle, and working a world in one way has become more technological, but also more primitive. And I think the point I want to kind of also make is that I mean, I believe in architecture that comes from ideas. I think architecture is never a reaction to just the context. I think there's always an idea preceding the context. And I think like what this kind of investigation into this fundamental core of architecture, into these parts does, is also that it's something that we share, right? It's this like this primitive nature that we kind of share. Like if you look at these, like this is my collection of Japanese log cabins and temples that I made during like some of my trips to Japan. And you see that, I mean, this is actually like this kind of organization that you see here of parts is universally shared, right? I mean, we do that in any part of the world where we work with timber that comes back, right? So I think there is something in like working with this like parts-hood relationships that that is also, an idea that in one way is, I mean, I wouldn't want to say universal as a kind of a modernist term, but that is shared, right? Like this as well, Kenzo Tange's Kagawa prefecture office, which is also kind of something that I think has traveled the world in terms of ideas, right? So this is like, these temples that have been absorbed by Frank Lloyd Wright and by like the early modernists, and then that comes back in a kind of concrete modernism. It has changed materials, but there is something I think culturally shared there. So I'll skip this one. That's another primitive hut we did for Helsinki, which is actually the same project as the concert hall, but just the lobby of the concert hall rotated 45 degrees. The operation of the serial architect. And I think I want to close with this. Like I want to kind of say that in a way, also what we're doing here right now, it's like every one of you in the audience as well. Like what we're ultimately doing is building culture. I think that's I like to kind of pick up on a quote that Mario Carpo gave just in an Instagram lecture last week, where he was asked if architecture is a business, and he was like, no, it's not a business, it's a vocation, right? And we have a mission. And I think that mission is building culture. Right? It's a culture of building, but it's also building culture. I think in anything that we do in like writing books and doing designs and bringing together people, that we're doing that, right? It's like this is Pinterest. If you look for discrete stuff, you can see that this is, it's not only kind of, it's a project that many people have contributed to and worked on, right? And I think it's interesting that like looking back now that we're all kind of contained to Zoom and that our normal life is kind of interrupted, I would kind of like think back that building culture is really that conversation, right? And what you see, I mean, like here, for example, is colleagues and friends and other architects generously discussing the work and helping to shape these agendas, right? Like this is Patrick Schumacher here and Roland Snooks and Matias Del Campo having a debate about the Diamonds House and kind of like trying to figure out what this thing is, right? Or Greg Lynn I showed my broken curse to Greg Lynn that day with Frederick Migaru. And I think it's like this collective endeavor, right? This endeavor of like all of these people continuously discussing with each other and kind of giving input and trying to understand each other's work that creates that kind of building culture, right? And I think that's extremely important. And that's also why, I mean, I immediately wanted to do this like lecture for Live Academy and for when Riyad asked me to kind of show that that conversation is so important, right? And that we should not kind of miss out on that now that we're locked up. And also the conversation, obviously, with like, you know, the people who are working with us in our and in my own office, like are obviously crucial for that like building culture, right? This kind of insane commitment, I think, of architects to kind of, you know, run like do this enormous, spend this enormous amounts of human energy on contributing something to that culture, right? And I think that's fantastic. Like kind of discussions here with Antoine Picon and Maria Iabolina, presentations, right? Engaging with the audience and debating these things, visiting fellow architects like Philippe Yuan here in Shanghai, or like Philip Bloch's buildings, going to see those things and kind of, you know, this kind of back and forth between the insanity of sitting at your computer or your laptop somewhere in the world, checking out projects and then being able to kind of like debate them and share them with friends, right? So that's in a way kind of my invite is like that we use these platforms to debate, contribute to this shared cultural project, right? That this is a kind of a moment to accelerate that sharing and that debate. So with that note, I would like to finish the lecture and thanks again to the organizers and to the audience for having me. My apologies for being, I believe, 10 minutes over time. Inevitable. Thank you so much. And I'll be happy to take some questions now.
That's great. Thank you so much, Gilles, for the wonderful presentation. And indeed, it was very different than your usual presentations. You kind of walked us through a serial chronology almost of your practice and your discourse, and that was very interesting, especially that for this particular one, our audience is kind of a younger demographic. I'm sure they follow your teachings at the Bartlett, a lot of them. One comment that I had before we start the questions is that it was very clear, and I think we had this kind of conversation in the Venice Biennale exactly 2 years ago now, which is that an interesting point that you brought up, Peter Cook's comment about architecture is not just a profession, it's a vocation. And I see this as kind of almost polar opposite ends of a spectrum. And every architect chooses to allocate themselves at one end of the spectrum or the other. It's clear that your work is kind of moving more towards rationalization, but also rationalization that is inherent in the philosophy of your work. And that's very interesting that you made it clear to me how the transition from Blokhut onwards made sense and it has roots in your earlier work at DRL. So thank you for that. My question is, to what point do you move closer to the other end of the spectrum? To what point do you basically say, okay, this is when we stop kind of being pulled in different directions as architects and we set our sort of red line, so to speak, as opposite to what you would find as challenges as client demands or people maybe sometimes not accepting a certain aesthetic and being more pulled towards a certain thing in terms of aesthetics or budgetary concerns. I mean, I really see the last museum as, like as you said, as a perfect representation of not giving in too much, but in the same time being very rational in your approach.
Yep.
So what is your comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an extremely good question, right? And an extremely interesting debate. And I think, I mean, we also, you know, when we were talking in Venice 2 years ago with like beers on a beautiful square, I think it also turns out like, I mean, I deliberately want to build, right? Like, I don't want to be, let's call it a paper architect. Not because, I mean, I have something against paper architecture. I don't think so. I mean, it's one, you can practice architecture in many ways, right? And I don't think there's one way. But I know that for my way of working building is important, right? It is kind of the title of my lecture was building. So if I don't build, I'm in trouble for like the way I've kind of set up things, right? And for other people, that's, you know, that's different, right? And I mean, I've also, I think I'm interested in kind of being grounded in reality. Like I'm interested in, you know, working not in a kind of a, you know, I'm not interested in doing projects that could be built only in like 500 years or 200 years. I'm very interested in the world right now and in the idea, like, if I need to do this now, how can I do that, right? So that's in a way, I mean, that's kind of what I wanted to show a bit with this lecture. Yeah, this journey from the kind of an avant-garde vision on like, oh, you know, a kind of a world that you're creating for yourself, and then the gradual process of moving that to reality, right? And embedded in that is, of course, this question, which I, you know, with a bit of a joke, I call, how low can you go, right? Which
right.
How low can you make the resolution, but how low can you go? Like at what point do you pull out and you see like, I've just like messed up like 10 years of work and I've like made myself a joke by doing this building, right? And I'm interested in that, right? I'm interested in kind of like finding how much how low we can go with that. I mean, not that I would not want to build my high-risk projects. I mean, I would love to build my high-risk projects, right? I mean, like that's what I'm aiming for. But I don't think you can. I think you need to work with you know, with what's available, right? And I mean, I know that if I would try to start an office with like the things that I was showing that are very high risk, I mean, I can wait for 20 years and get very frustrated. So I'm willing to kind of like push the slider a bit back, get built, and through that process get people on board and be like, hey, you know, next time we build this thing, we can do it, right? So that's the model, I think. And then, like, I think some people in some previous generations have kind of been more radical than less pragmatic in that, right? It's like some people, so some of my close friends as well have been like really being uncompromising and like it needs to be exactly this. But I think you can. It's probably not possible in all work, but I know that in my work I can switch that slider back and forth. Like that's possible.
And I think that that's the most intriguing part of the lecture for me is, I mean, it was kind of subconsciously in my mind before you said it and before we had this conversation. I haven't seen you in a while, but it really seemed that way. And I think that maybe just like this approach a lot more, definitely. So I'll leave more room for the audience. We have a lot of questions opening up. And just one quick reminder, everybody, if you'd like to go on video, please use the raise hand tool and we'll put you live as a panelist to ask your question to Gilles on video. And if you'd like me to read your question to Gilles, please post it in the Q&A box. So we have Ghanem Yunus, who kind of braved the raise hand option.
Great.
Host, can you please promote Ghanem Yunus? Ghanem, I believe, is logging in from Dubai, and there he is. How's it going, Ghanem?
Hey.
Your audio is not on.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. So first of all, it's a great lecture. Very interesting work, but made me wanted to ask you is, for example, you were showing this project in the beginning about the house that you were making for your friend. What sort of, could you elaborate what sort of didn't work? Why did you have to resolve to a more traditional sort of finish at the end? Even though you were selling it more of something that is practical, something that can be built, something that's completely, extremely rational and, so to speak, budget friendly. What sort of failed there? And lastly, does context matter in the design process and the type of buildings and type of architecture that you do? Thank you.
Cool, two great questions. Thanks for that. So with the Blokhut project, I mean, just to make it clear, the building that I showed that was constructed in the end was not my design, right? That was the guy himself that like built that building. But like where that Blokhut project went wrong, I mean, on the one hand, I would say like, I think back when we were doing that, we didn't entirely understand from our side yet how we would be building those things. Like we had that kind of vision and we built a huge model to kind of think through how we would construct that. We were actually not even thinking to build it in timber. We were going to build it in precast, you know, blocks, like concrete blocks or something. So we kind of deeply underestimated, I think we didn't entirely understand how to construct that thing. So that's one thing. Like if now I know completely how we would build it, right? It's like, and that's what we're working on, obviously, with like clients, and when people come to us, like that's one of the projects that we want to push through. Back then we didn't know that. And then, I mean, I don't, the other thing is just, I mean, the reality of this kind of like, when you go to building, especially with individuals, I mean, it's an enormous risk to build something. There are very little people out there who want to be like a kind of Patreons or a mecenas who's like, oh, here, you know, 300,000, 600,000, a million, do what you want to do, build me. Those people exist, but they're, you know, most people, at least in my circle, are not like that, right? So it's they would not take that kind of risk for architecture, although they love it, right? I mean, it's like, it's difficult to be like, oh yeah, we will build like the first prototype for your practice. Like that doesn't happen, right? Like I think the journey to getting something built is, you can't shortcut it. You need to prove it that you can do it. Like with the installation here behind me, you show that you can do it, and then gradually, at some point, you reach a scale that is built, and then from there you can kind of convince people, and also you don't put people in risk, right? Like the other thing would be like, you know, back then, if you would seriously ask me, like, are you willing to build this for your friend? I mean, I could have bankrupted him, right? If you don't know exactly how to do it. So there's also a responsibility that we have there. And then the second question was about context. And I think, I mean, I've hinted a bit at that in my talk, that, I mean, I think there's like two kinds of architects. There's many kinds of architects, but I mean, you could say there are two kind of positions. There's architects who believe that the ideas precedes the context or the site. So they are, in a way, they have a body of ideas, and then they confront the site with that. That doesn't mean that they ignore the context. They will still obviously try to, whatever they do, to kind of like fit that in a context and work with that. I mean, you know, many architects like that, Zaha Hadid, Herzog de Meuron in some cases, not always. Sejima is Sejima wherever in the world. Sejima is Sejima. Fujimoto is Fujimoto. Like Gary is Gary. You know, like those people, it's not that they wait and like when they have a site, they're like, oh, I could do something like that, right? I mean, actually most architects, they exist before the site, and they have ideas before the site, and they will try to fit them in the context. There are some architects who say that they are deeply contextual, but then still I would argue that although they maybe work a lot with context, I would still think that they have a method in their minds how to work with context that precedes the context. So in that sense, you could kind of argue that architects are never truly, really contextual. But like in my case, when I would work with context, I mean, I would, for example, think that if I would build in Dubai, hopefully after this lecture, I get an invitation to build something in Dubai, then, I mean, I would not build something in timber, right? Because timber for me, it would be an absurd story to try to like ship timber from Sweden to Dubai.
Right.
And I would be more interested, obviously, to look at like my way of thinking about architecture, but adapt it to materials that are locally available, right? So I wouldn't change my idea about architecture, but I would try to do it with other materials. I would look at local materials, right? And through that, you can kind of get contextual. And maybe just the last point also, like I was hinting at that as well with showing these Japanese temples at some point. Like essentially, if you look, for example, at timber architecture and history across the world, it's extremely similar, right? So you will see details in Japanese houses that are the same as Swiss chalets, that then come back also in other parts of the world. So I think like if you look at architecture through this kind of like part relations, you can see a lot of similarities. I mean, pyramids, you know, they're built ziggurats, like stacking piles. Yeah, every continent has done that, right? So I believe that like by looking at like the act of building, that we can do something that we all share, and that bypasses in a way like we can all kind of, it's so primitive that it's like a bottom line that we all can react to, basically. Like, yeah.
And then we've had this conversation before, Gilles, and you mentioned that, you know, these parts would be wonderful to build in stone, and I completely agree. Shubham's question is kind of on the same point. What is the material of the block? I believe you did answer that, unless you wanted to expand. What is the material of the blocks?
I mean, there's no fixed material, right? I have been mainly working in timber for this block, mainly because timber is very accessible. It was for me a good stepping stone. I would love to do them in stone, as Riyad just mentioned. I mean, I would love to do that, but it's just a bit, it's not something you can quickly access. You need to go to a quarry, you need a heavy robot, but I would love to do that in stone. I would love to do them in precast concrete. I would, love to do them in all kinds of materials. Like it's not, I'm not dead set on timber. Timber just happens to be a really good material for automation. It's environmentally friendly. It's very kind of, I mean, it's a great material to work with, but I wouldn't say that I'm only interested in timber.
So Anonymous is asking, how did you get the black color? What kind of paint is it? And how do you decide which parts of the building do you paint black, or the planes that you should paint black?
Great question. I mean, I have an obsession with black, as many architects. It's not very original. A lot of architects always dress in black as well. But I mean, beyond like, I mean, I like black. Probably aesthetically, I'm attracted to that because it's this kind of primitive, right? It's this kind of like fundamental thing. It's the zero, right? And I'm kind of attracted to those kind of things. And I generally like black buildings. Like I'm a big fan of like Nice's National Gallery. Also Peter Zumthor's Pavilion for Serpentine, I thought was very beautiful. I'm working on a very black building right now as well. So I mean, I like that, I guess, for its neutrality and its kind of boldness. And then what I wanted to do with the building blocks by kind of painting the like that's really the kind of super stylistic thing, right? Like painting these things black, right? And like that is kind of in a way like over accentuating the kind of the ends of the part. It's to show this part remains autonomous, but that it has kind of, it's kind of like emphasizing its connections, but also its ends. And like I think that it gives just like a really strange reading to like this installation. It helps that you kind of look at these buildings almost like as if you took a section, right? But the section is not straight. The section is kind of jagged. And like, it's like the section stops with every part. And I think that aesthetic is like, has become like really important for my practice, right? Like I always paint all of these edges, right? They're black or white, right? I'm challenging some of my students now. I'm doing a visiting professorship in Hong Kong of experimenting with 2 new colors for them to break the black timber aesthetic. So they're doing tangerine, which is like a orange yellow, or blue foam blue, basically, like that. We're kind of playing with that. Very, very difficult.
I love that color. We use it quite a bit also in combination with white. We're also very careful with color in our design. But I do agree the black gives a lot of depth, especially on the facade. And I really like how you do it. Anonymous is asking, and I heard that you're back to teaching in September, and Anonymous wanted to ask, will you be teaching your cluster UCL face-to-face?
Oh, that's the question that everyone wants to know. I mean, I would also like to know the answer to that question, Anonymous. Unfortunately, we don't know that yet. That is still, UCL is doing everything they can to make it face-to-face. That's the mission of the school. But I mean, we also have a government that has rules. We have situations such as a potential second wave of the pandemic. It's extremely difficult for us to give an answer to that, but I mean, everyone wants to, right? Everyone wants to be teaching face-to-face. But I can tell you as well that for BPro, I mean, we are preparing for all situations. If it would not be face-to-face, we would offer a kind of a uniquely tailored program that would, for the period that it would not be face-to-face. Like, we would obviously, software tutorials are great for online teaching. So if it would not be face-to-face, we would actually be able to offer a much more exciting package for computational design training, but like an insane package. Just as, with Live Academy do Zoom lectures, we would be able to do classes that normally would only be for 20 people. We can now offer all students in BPro access to all computational classes. So you could learn only like 9 times more than you would otherwise learn when we are constrained to classrooms. We would same for theory. So I mean, personally, I've been teaching a lot online. I've been teaching studios. Also before the pandemic, I've been teaching in Australia and in Hong Kong. And I personally really enjoy the format. I think it has a limited time. At some point, it's good we come back together in the same space. But for me, it's I think it's a different world, but I think we can do something really, really productive with it as well. So I wouldn't.
Sure, and I mean the hundreds of people that joined us today, with coming from tons of countries, is just a testament to that. And it's great to have you, Gilles from London. Yasmin is saying, very interesting lecture. She's asking, how did you start investigating your passion in architecture and reaching to this idea that you have, or kind of your ethos or your thesis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I mean, like that idea is, I like to think that it's that every architect has somehow his or her idea, right? And that kind of emerges. Obviously, it's deeply personal, right? I mean, some architects, like, it's not that they're really, I mean, really terrible ideas or really, really, really brilliant ideas. I think all the kind of good architects in their own rights have posed an interesting question, right? And that question starts to drive their practice. And I mean, for me, I think I tried to kind of talk a bit about that to give you a bit of insight in like the beginning of the lecture, that it came a bit from my personal experiences as well, right? It came really, I think, from that kind of journey of like, going to Switzerland, going to the DRL, confronting these worlds, and then kind of, being at a moment in London where there was a particular kind of intellectual climate, after the crisis, and like a particular set of writings. And it's that like kind of all this kind of, I mean, you could call the environment, right? And then all of a sudden triggers something in you where you're like, I'm super interested in this thing. Like, I'm going to keep working on that. And I believe that architecture, I mean, it's tolerant to many, many, many questions. So I would like to kind of invite everyone to kind of find those questions, right? It's not like that we all need to discretize the entire world. Like that is not a mission, right? It's something that I'm super interested in, and a bunch of other people are super interested in, but it's not a kind of like, it's not that architecture has to be discrete. I mean, there's many other interesting questions that you can ask from architecture.
And Michelle is asking a very interesting question. So we talked about how low can you go. Michelle is asking, how high can you go? Or how high are you willing to go?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, I think for me, there's an obvious, I don't believe in that, like, something gets per definition much better when it is much higher resolved. Like, I think there are clear limits to the upper line. Like, it's not and some of my colleagues like disagree with that very strongly, that, for me, the point is not a high-res architecture. Like, I don't think so. I do believe that obviously with the tools that we have available, we can control many, many more parts, and we can deal with them, in a computational way. And obviously we could control thousands and thousands of little bits and pieces, millions. But the question is also, like, I mean, that in itself is not a quality, right? It's an absurd kind of thing to set that as an end goal. The question is, like, why would you want to have many, many little parts? Now, there are many, many reasons why you would not want to have tiny little parts, because every part needs a joint to another part, and the joint is where things break, and the joints are more expensive, and they're laborious. So technically, you don't want to have a lot. I mean, at least in my case, when I'm doing these buildings, it's way more efficient to build them with less parts. Like, the bigger the parts are, the more efficient it is to build, right? So that's a technical one. On the other hand, I think also aesthetically, I'm not interested in tiny little parts. I like huge, chunky architectural parts. I like to kind of, I think that's a quality that we have lost in architecture. I think if you look at historic buildings, I like the scale of those things. Like, your body gets confronted with a stone that is like, twice your size. And I think that is great. And like, I think if in a lot of buildings that I'm in today, I hated that first. I just hate that everything is finicky, right? Like, small, little, crappy bits and pieces that you can like peel off, or like that have, like, I like the like the scale that we're working with for most of this project is kind of human body scale. Like, and that's different. Like, it is that you really meet a part. You cannot ignore that there is an architectural part there. And that part is not a silly part. It's a part that's constructing the form of that, your experience. And you can directly relate to it with your body because it's on the scale of your body. So for me, that's the ideal size. Like, for me, these parts don't need to get much smaller. I don't have a mission there. Some other people have. That's their question. But like, for me, that's not.
Faisal is raising his hand to go live. So host, please promote Faisal for a live question. Gilles, how are we doing on time? Can you still take the next open questions?
Yes,
There are 10 of them.
I'll still take a few, yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, people's response has been phenomenal. You know, the questions are mostly comments about how great the presentation was and then a question. So let's not, let's give them the time. Faisal, how are you doing? Please connect your mic. Faisal, how are you doing?
Hi.
Where are you joining us from?
From Dubai. From Dubai.
Hey.
Amazing. Welcome to Live Academy, Faisal. What is your question to Gilles?
My question is, I feel like architecture is inevitably moving towards a sort of kinetic architecture, sort of, as Greg Lynn puts it, animate form. Do you feel like having control and freedom of parts contributes to that in a way?
I mean, I'm actually like recently more and more interested in kind of adaptive aspects of architecture. Like, I kind of like, before, if you would have asked me this question 2 or 3 years ago, I would have been like, oh, I'm not interested in kinetic architecture. I hate it. I would be like, architecture doesn't need to move. It needs to be. But like, of course, by, you know, the way that we're working with these pieces, it's logical that the question of time in these projects changes, right? Because if you work towards, you know, in a continuous way, you work towards a final whole, and that whole is perfect, and it will stay like that forever, right? Like, that's a kind of one way, right? But like, in this way, all of these structures are kind of, in one way or another, adaptive. You could remove a part, you could add a part, right? So there is another notion of time. Like, all of these buildings, you can technically also take them apart again and reconstruct them somewhere else in another form. So I got interested again in some of these questions of adaptation and kinetics. And we're working now, I mean, mainly in BPro at the Bartlett. We're asking lots of questions with our students where we're embedding robotics into these building blocks. So you would be able to, for example, robotically control a position of a part, so that by moving the position of the part, you change entirely the functionality or the use of a space, right? So we're working on that. And I would say, I mean, it's a very minimalist use of like a kinetic architecture. Like, some of the examples we know of like kinetic architecture is that everything moves and it's like this kind of wild kind of, you know, world. In our case, it's very minimalist. So it's really just like a block that like silently just moves to the side. And by moving, it changes everything. So super interested in that. Absolutely. Like, right now, I am a big kind of, I'm definitely interested in that. Very different from like what Greg Lynn with animate form wants to do. That's definitely interesting.
Awesome.
Amazing. Thank you, Faisal, for your question. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Thanks.
So the next question is from Alicia, who's saying, thanks, Gilles. Very interesting. The space needs in the current crisis spatial needs in the current crisis seem to have changed. Does the use of single repeating parts, modularity, give you more flexibility to design and adapt to new necessities? I understand that your work is about ideas. How about the needs of the user, society, and how does that come to play?
Yep, that's also, I think, super interesting. I mean, I think I would like to kind of think that ideas are not opposed to you know, the desires from the user, of course. And I mean, I like this, I briefly hinted at that as well, that I think sometimes that architects are too much, when they think too actively about the user, when they become functionalist, that they usually mess up things. Like, I truly believe that the best architecture is architecture that was initially kind of that has no relationship between form and function, right? That is architecture that is either like complete form or that was not thinking about form at all and not thinking about function at all. And there are these examples that you know, parking garages, which I designed to park cars, are incredible museums. You know, so I mean, I often think that somehow architects trying to deliberately do something really, really like, they're like, I'm going to do a really good job here. I'm going to make this building function perfectly. That's where everything goes wrong. Like I believe more in kind of creating spaces that are with their position on functionality a bit further removed from the users, so that users can fill them in themselves, because they are usually the best at making decisions how they want to use spaces. So I believe in like the loft model, the kind of the idea that like all of my buildings, I always say they're not designed for they don't explicitly cater for human inhabitation. They're providing a platform that then people can move into and they can begin to inhabit that. And I think that that's also on an aesthetic level a great experience. I mean, like I think the spaces that appeal to us as people are spaces that are generally, you know, devoid of kind of direct function, right? Like, for example, we love ruins. Just because ruins have been stripped of their function, they kind of like give us this kind of aesthetic experience. We like big abandoned factories for that reason as well. You like kind of some natural formations as well. Like I think embedding everything with a kind of idea of like wanting to be a good functional architect messes up buildings. And then in the kind of now in like the kind of COVID times, and I would say that generally I think seriality and like this discrete approach offers a possibility for adaptation. Mm. And I think that's important, because that means that you're not stuck with a fixed final form. You can adapt things in one way or another. And I like that, right? I like the fact that you could, in a very quick way, maybe adapt an apartment or change a condition, right? And like, I mean, that's also like generally my position on like housing. Like I would try when I do, like we're working on a lot of like housing projects where the idea is that like, I mean, I find it crazy that across the world, we all think that housing consists of like 1, 2, 3 bedroom apartments. I think it's incredibly like, usually housing projects as students, if you do them as a student, are the most boring thing you have to do. But actually they're the most important thing as an architect, right? I think you can do so much when you start to question basically this kind of form function approach as like 1 to 3 bedroom, right? Like, so my students who are working on housing do this, like, I think pretty amazing projects where, you know, where function is really up to like people inhabiting them, right? The building kind of accommodates incredible kind of differences in lifestyle and in use and changes over time, and tries to kind of disrupt that like super functionalist approach. So I would like to say like, yeah, I hope this Corona crisis pushes basically the desire for more adaptation in those things.
I really like that idea, and it's the opposite of the dogmatic architect with a capital A sort of, you know, drawing on the plan where people should live and where people should live, etc. So we've got another question here from Kirti saying, thanks for sharing your journey, Gilles. It's very insightful and a new approach with really beautiful diagrams, clearly illustrating the ideas and processes behind discrete assemblies. I was just wondering if you had also explored varying material properties along with the geometries for a few custom parts, make large-scale buildings perform better structurally in the built space. Mm-hmm. So is there a performance criteria or characteristic to the materials that you assign to these objects?
I mean, it's like the question that we're asking on a structural level from these parts is of course like very strange, right? Because we're building buildings where a part does not know its function yet. Like the part will be used and it will, together with other parts, give rise to a certain function. And that's super strange, right? Like normally as an architect, you have a part that is derived from its position in the hall. Like this column is at the bottom of the building, it's carrying this load, so it will look like this. In this case, it's different. The parts exist before the building comes into being. So the parts, I mean, I call it sometimes the Volvo principle. So the Volvo principle is like, the Volvo is also the car that most architects, at least in Europe, drive. It's like a, like engineers drive Audi and architects drive Volvo.
Volvo is known for its safety features.
Yes, exactly.
So it almost
Volvo,
should be the opposite.
Yeah, like a Volvo, like the kind of the principle behind a Volvo, their strategy was that they never wanted to be the best car and they never wanted to be the worst car. They wanted to be a 7 out of 10. And they were, like there's the same like my mom told me when I went to school. She was like, you don't need an 8, but like don't get a 6. A 7 is good enough, right? Like so a Volvo is that like, and so the Volvo principle with its parts is that they need to always do fine wherever they are in the structure. They will never be optimal, but they will always be fine, right? It's a 7 out of 10. So like that's one principle. And then the funny thing is, I mean, we work a lot on what is hidden behind these kind of like blocks, right? Like there is actually really kind of a structural research on like where we position frames and how we create stiffness in these blocks and how they perform. There's like an amazing research behind how we're doing that. But that research is less dependent actually on material properties and is more dependent on geometry. Like this is actually, and I mean, in other lectures I've explained that that comes from like the digital materials world, which is kind of a specific field of robotics and computer science that has been pioneered at MIT for like going to space. And they're basically like looking basically at the same questions, how basically Lego-like parts that are always the same can create overarching structures that are highly optimized, yet you don't need to change the part. So we are, I mean, in a very amateurish way compared to these guys, we are trying to ask those same questions, right? And they're not so dependent on material, they're dependent on geometry and topology of these parts.
And on scale, Alawiya is asking, what are the possible challenges when the discrete modular design system is applied to enormously big scale projects, considering it using or relying on a single material strength?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about like enormously big projects, like let's say a tower, I mean, of course, I mean, I think I'm also pragmatic. Like I would not be like, oh, you know, my building block needs to be exactly the same wall thickness at the bottom as at the top. I mean, we could make types, right? You could still make like, you could still introduce some kind of gradient if you get into like a high-rise scenario where obviously the load conditions are kind of challenging, right? Until now, though, I have to say we haven't really been confronted with that so much yet. Like even, for example, the Nuremberg concert hall, which is a pretty big building, like in that building, actually the thickness of the CLT is the same at the bottom of the building as at the top, just because of fire regulations. So actually on a structure level, you could like thin out the building to the top, but then you would basically not be conform with fire regulations. So in a funny way, like the fire regulations kind of helped me to kind of, you know,
make the client.
Like they were all the same sheets of timber. Of course, I mean, if you go to a tower scenario, that kind of would change, right? But for me, that was a creative challenge. I mean, there's famously like Louis Kahn, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but like Louis Kahn proposed a tower where like instead of thinning out, like he has one where the columns thin out towards the top, and then he has another one where the columns are all the same, but there's just more columns at the bottom. Which is two strategies, right? So I'm obviously like would try to do the second strategy that you have more elements at the bottom, and then gradually the amount of elements thins out at the top of the building. Like that, these would be some of the strategies.
Anonymous is asking, in the Germany project competition, I understand that these elements are parts and not architectural classic elements, but what makes you think that a column is not a column? Is it functioning like a column, structurally at least? And the same applies for the slab or wall. I mean, it could be a different version of the known architectural elements.
Yeah.
I guess he's asking, how is that different than the domino house?
Yeah, well, like that's something that I hear a lot, right? So people are like, no, but this is a slab, or like this is, because it's like a straight flat line that people walk over. I mean, that is a strange definition of an architectural element, right? Like a slab is not, like the definition is not, if you have a straight like line in the building that people walk over, you have a slab. Like a slab is basically it's a piece, it's an architectural element that is a slab. So like generally what is happening in the projects is that you have parts that have no function and they get positioned in the building, and at that moment they assume a certain function, or together with other parts they give rise to a certain function. function. So function is an emergent property of the assembly. Function is not embedded in the parts, which is the kind of the modernist model. So of course, at some point in that building, when these parts are assembled, you could say, well, you know, this cluster here of 20 parts forms the living room. If that happens to be the living room, sure. But the idea of the living room does not influence the parts. The same with a floor slab and a column. Of course, at some point, 5 parts will perform together. They will assume the role of a column, but they're not a column as such, right? And all of these parts together will become, in the end, a building, right? But I mean, they're not derived from the building. So, of course, but I mean, the question is right to say that when the resolution of these parts gets very low, it gets a bit confusing, because then, like in the concert hall, for example, in Nuremberg, there is one part that spans from, you know, the bottom from a space to the top, which you could say is a column by itself, right? But still, technically, I mean, it's technically you can still make the argument that, you know, that very same part also lays horizontally on top of that, like column-like part. It's the same element. Like when it arrives with a truck, you could have chosen, you know, any part, you position it, and then it assumes its function, right? So it's not specifically designed for that function. Therefore, it is not a column. Therefore, also the slab is not a slab. Right? But ultimately, they function as such.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Anonymous is asking, great projects. Is there a tensile or fabric alternative to this sort of timber architecture that you showed?
Ooh, no, no. I mean, like it's actually a very nice question. I mean, because I mean, tensile architecture obviously would be the example of architecture that is based on overarching form, right? It's the opposite of a discrete architecture, because you need to, you know, it finds its own shape by like spanning that form, right? It's actually like on I mean, there are some people who are trying to do that. So like you can check out the work by Ryan Manning, who's working with like basically inflated animals that he's stacking together as a discrete. So yes, you can. Also, my colleague Manuel Jimenez, he's doing like kind of tensile-like kind of assemblies with like flexible wires that connect to each other that also have an element of discreteness to them. So yes. And then, I mean, ultimately you could also say with like, but that, I mean, that is then for me gets a bit distracting. But I mean, you could also argue that knitting, you know, knitting by itself is the precedent for computation, right? Computation started with a knitting machine because they were creating this kind of programmable cards to instruct a machine. And of course, knitting is a highly serialized and discrete process, right? I mean, it is, right? It's a repetition of the same kind of like action that then textures a fabric. So there is a deep relationship between the kind of between fabrics and the act of constructing fabrics and the work that I was showing today. It's just that like it gets a bit confusing that then once knitted, it performs in a very different way than obviously like the structures that I'm showing here.
We have one question from Roman Korev, who's asking, we are stuck in transition between an old way of construction and a new one that will completely reshape the way buildings are designed. You are pushing a new design approach, being limited by affordable way of construction, which is serial production. Nevertheless, the outcome is astonishing. Do you think a human hand complemented by a machine producing standard building blocks can be replaced by a robotic hand in a close future, changing faster architecture into new vector aesthetics?
Yeah, I mean, we're working actively on like making that whole process automated, right? Like we're actually striving to assemble, like to take out the kind of human labor in the assembly process. Like I would really like, and that's also not rocket science. I mean, you can do that like right now. It just needs a bit of, you know, a good case to begin to do it, aka a good budget to begin to do that. But it's absolutely, I mean, we are absolutely working also with AUAR, with the design tech consultancy. We're absolutely working towards kind of fully automating the assembly of these blocks. We've already done that, like proven that also with the students. Like we had some robots like building blocks themselves. The one thing that is a bit more, I mean, which I'm interested in, but that's a bit more like far-fetched, is the idea of like distributed robots that build these buildings on site. I showed a few renders in the lecture, but didn't really speak about it. I mean, that is something that is a super interesting research domain. We're also working on that in BPRO quite actively in a few clusters. but that's something that I don't see immediately kind of happening within the next few decades because it's a very difficult question. And ultimately, I mean, we are actually quite good at assembling things on site, I think, in general, the building industry. It's more like if you reduce the amount of steps and like your buildings, you know, come in the kind of monolithic chunks, it's actually quite easy to kind of like coordinate replacement on site. You don't necessarily need a robot for that. But I think, I mean, to say though about the human hand, maybe in a more symbolic meaning, I do think like, you know, in kind of my practice, the human hand is quite important, right? As a kind of a design tool, like I do sketch, I do manipulate and judge every single thing, right? This is not a kind of just random aggregations, right? Like there's a high degree of authoring and authorship in there.
Florence Vivian Rush is asking, first of all, thank you. Your talk was highly interesting. You show us your projects for building museums, an entity in the forest, a concert hall. Did you already build an office building? And how would an office building that Gilles Retsin designs would look like?
Oh, this is actually a great question. Like I'm super interested in office buildings. I actually I've actually been working for almost a year now with a big with an office client who wants us to redesign the future of the office. I told Riyad actually last time when we were talking about it. So with these guys, we have kind of really been setting up a whole research into offices, right, and into work culture and kind of that kind of world. I'm super interested in that, and I think this discrete method works really well for offices because you can easily adapt, right? Like you can easily change configurations, you can reconfigure with the same parts. I would also, you should also check out the office. I mean, I showed it briefly in the presentation, the AUAR home office. You can Google that. So we built our own office with AUAR as a kind of an experiment, and that's been also kind of inspiring. I think multiple companies who are like kind of reaching out about this this model that they find it very, very interesting. Because we can like do something that is not an open office and that is not a kind of like a you know, kind of capsule enclosed office. Like you can kind of tailor conditions. So super interested in office buildings.
Great. Agustina is asking or saying, first, thank you, just wow. Secondly, have you ever considered fabricating your components in glass? The glass facades seem to be the only thing outside of your system. Very interesting observation. Maybe creating them in glass, actually structural glass, and or creating 2D zigzag glass pieces. That would be also modifying the interior-exterior visual perception of the space.
Yeah, very, very good question. I mean, I also get kind of asked this question a lot in lectures. So I'm against facades. I don't like facades as an architectural project. I think architects have done too many facades and made that a project, and in doing that, they have forgotten about the kind of the bones of the building. So my buildings actively try not to have a facade, right? The facade is deliberately an afterthought. Like it does not like figure in the design process. I have not spent like a single word on a facade in this lecture, right? So the buildings, when you see them, I would like to say that they just stop. It's like you took a section of the building, you put glass, the building is closed, that's it. You just see it has no it's designed completely from the inside out. Right? The glass facade is just a kind of glass kind of curtain facade kind of thing. Now, I mean, I do have to say, like, we end up spending a lot of time working on making these facades as simple as I represent them, because facades are actually like really, really difficult to do, right? It is a huge question for us as a kind of a practice to try to figure that out. Also, like, I mean, the project I'm working on now, we just got a quote for glass, and the glass is more expensive than all the timber together. It's just like, oh, like we need to think more about glass, right? How to do that. And I mean, there's in the Nuremberg concert hall, like that's the only project that we've wrapped the glass really as a box around it, just because of like pure pragmatism. The glass obviously follows the modular grid of the structure itself. So the glass has a relationship with the modular grid. I would not like style the glass in the shape of the blocks, because I think that's a bit cheesy. Like you need to know when to stop. Like just as I would never make a staircase out of discrete pieces. I think that's like not done. Like it's like you need to know when to stop, right? Like otherwise you can make everything in discrete pieces. I don't want to sit on like a sofa made of discrete pieces, right? I mean, like the staircases are basically always continuous, super highly customized staircases, and the glass facades are just also like deliberately pushed outside of the system. There is one case though. I mean, I do like, for example, what Olafur Eliasson did in Reykjavik with the concert hall. Those are actually kind of discrete glass pieces. That's actually very beautiful. So I mean, maybe at some point we could kind of like consider. We played a little bit with that for the concert hall in Nuremberg, but then we thought it was a bit distracting. But essentially, architects have done too many facades. Please ignore facades for a bit. Like we can come back now. Too many.
I love that very clean, simple, minimalist approach that you've taken to glass in that project, almost like an Apple store, but then what's inside the bones of the building is what's highlighted.
Yeah, the glass for the concert hall is Apple Store glass, actually.
It's the structural thick glass. I mean, I've worked at a facade consultancy where we learned a lot about that. So the last question to end this talk tonight, and thank you so much for taking your time with answering the questions, Gilles, is a very controversial question. So we'll end it on that note. So the question is, do you agree with Patrick Schumacher's last framing that discretism, discrete architecture, and virtualism, or object-oriented ontology architecture, are two of the 6 subsidiary styles within parametricism?
Well, I mean, I think we can answer this kind of in 2 ways. Like, I mean, I would first, of course, like disagree with that. Like, I would say, well, parametricism is one thing because it has its dogmas, right? Like Patrick wrote it clearly, like what the kind of the taboos and the dogmas are, and the discrete is opposed to those dogmas. I mean, like the parametricism is about superform and is about elements conforming to superform. Like that's the definition, right? I mean, like that's what happened. Every element is malleable, and like this is the opposite, right? Like in parametricism, every part derives from the whole, like that's it, right? And in this case, that is entirely different. Like the parts precede the whole, right? Parametricism also is also deliberately about curvature. And I mean, the discrete has no specific relationship to curvature. I mean, it's agnostic to curvature. We could work, I mean, it's not that we're against, like that this is against curvature. It's just that the system doesn't know that there is curvature. It's agnostic. Like you could figure out a system that makes it curved, but it's not, curvature is not a kind of fundamental goal for that. Then I would also say like that the discrete in its kind of, as a project, that it's, more and more also politically kind of taking a distance from the parametric. Like I think what Patrick has been writing about the parametric, that it's a real kind of free market system. It's deliberately positioned as something in relation to kind of ultra-libertarian politics, that it's about extreme free markets. I think most people who are part of the discrete discourse do not assign to those politics. We believe that architecture is something that should be a bit more generous, and that is doesn't deal very well with markets actually in general. And we believe in a kind of much more a project for the many. Like we deliberately work a lot on housing. We think that housing is super important. So I mean, I would say in that sense, like no. But I mean, you could also turn it around. I mean, I personally like, you know, if parametricism would be redefined in that sense that it contains both triple O and discrete and everything, I mean, sure. I mean, if it contains everything, then it's also like, you know, then it kind of lost its dogmas as well, right? I mean, so, I mean, I don't really care, to be honest. Like, I mean, if it is, you know, if it really is everything that has been progressive in the last decade, that has used computers, sure. I mean, then we're all parametricists. But then everyone can have their own position within that parametric umbrella. So I think that's actually more a question for Patrick, because I think if parametricism really contains all of these positions, then what is parametricism then still, right? Like then it becomes very heterogeneous. But yeah.
I'd love to end the lecture with a question from Gilles, and you know, we'd love to have Patrick on one of these lectures in the future. So thank you so much for your time, Gilles, and a wonderful presentation where it was personal, but also you've laid out your work in a way that is very understandable and you know, I thoroughly enjoyed it, as did the audience, from all the positive feedback that we're getting here. Stay safe wherever you are, and hopefully we meet up soon. Thanks, Gilles.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for all the great questions, and thanks, Riyad, for hosting this.